Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you all for joining us. And I'd love to just give a big hand to Nancy, Grace, and the team for just creating this beautiful gathering in this conference. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. All right, so yes, it's really an honor to be presenting, at least for me, at the Theosophical headquarters here of the American section, and to talk about the subject of the World Peace Diet and the consequences of our food choices and the consequences of our way we live. I think it's right exactly on the topic of eco-spirituality. Eco coming from the ancient Greek word, as we all know, oikos, which means home or house, and how we treat our home and the planet that we're living on, and the ancient wisdom teachings that help to guide us in that. The connection that we have with each other and with the natural order. So Maria did mention I have a couple of other books. I'll just mention them now. I probably won't ever mention them again, but because I'm going to talk about this. But just if you're interested, this is a book called Circles of Compassion, Essays Connecting Issues of Justice. And I think it ties in with a lot what we'll be saying. It's really focusing on social justice issues and an emerging field called Intersectionality, which is the interconnectedness of social justice issues like racism and sexism and ableism and heterosexism and human trafficking and all the different ways that we human beings abuse each other and how that's connected to speciesism or to our abuse of animals for an exploitation of other beings and ecosystems, how that's connected. So there's 29 other authors that I chose besides myself who made contributions to this. So if you want to kind of dive into social justice issues and how they're interconnected, this is the book for that. And then this is a new book. These are both pretty new. Your Inner Islands, The Keys to Intuitive Living. I got my PhD at Berkeley, actually, back in the 80s, focusing on educating intuition in adults, and I was able to really bring in the Buddhist teachings of understanding directly of prajna. And you would not want to read, even though that dissertation was nominated as the best dissertation in Berkeley that year, you would not want to read it. It was a very dry kind of dissertation. But this is a much more kind of interesting, it's a journey, and it has a lot of meditations and teachings on developing spiritual intuition. So that's a brand new book, just came out about 2 months ago. But mainly I'll be speaking about the World Peace Diet and some of the ideas that inform this book and some other ideas that have come since I wrote the book. It just came out in the 10th anniversary edition. And as Maria mentioned, I've been very fortunate, I feel, to be able, especially the last few years, to travel a lot to other countries, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, China, Taiwan. And everywhere I go, there's this enormous interest, really, in looking more deeply at the consequences of our mistreatment of animals, a routine and relentless mistreatment of animals in our society, and not only how that's affecting them, but how that's affecting our planet. And not only how it's affecting our planet, but how it's affecting our physical health, the health of our bodies. And not only that, what the World Peace Diet really goes into, I think, is how it affects us psychologically and spiritually. To be born into a culture where the fundamental ritual in our society is abusing animals. That's the basic thing we do. That's what we learn. That's the fundamental thing we learn. Every day, 3 times a day, we sit down to meals of abused animals, and we're taught that this is what we do to be living here. And yet it's all considered to be perfectly normal and natural, and so how does that affect us? So that's the basic question. And the point I come at the whole thing is like zero blame or anything like that. It's just to try to understand this, that we've all been wounded. Essentially, we've been born into a culture where we've been abused from the time we're little kids, and how we can heal that, how we can heal ourselves and heal our society so that we can actually, as we've been hearing already this morning, celebrate our lives on this enormously beautiful and abundant planet, which can easily support all of us if we actually acted according to the name we gave ourselves, Homo sapiens, if we actually acted in a wise way instead of being Homo destructus here. And so I think essentially the key to all of this in many ways is on our dinner plates. That's the interesting thing. That's what led me to that. My journey of exploration led me really back to the dinner plate. And so the underlying idea is a couple of things. One is that we live today in a herding culture. We do not think of ourselves as living in a herding society. We think, no, we live in kind of a high-tech, urban society. We're not poking sheep around and so forth. But the herding today is industrialized, it's mechanized, and it's on a massive scale, abusing animals and confining them and I've visited these places, on thousands or tens of thousands of animals. And it's out of sight. It's basically hidden away. And so we don't really participate in it anymore directly, but we participate indirectly with this, right? This is I don't know about the ballots anymore, if anybody's actually counting those or who's counting them, but these are where we really vote in our society, right? We take out our wallets and we pay for something, and so we're telling the system to create more of this. So we're living in a herding culture, and a herding society essentially is based around exploiting and confining other living beings and reducing them to commodities, learning to see them as merely objects, learning and teaching the children that certain beings are not beings. They are commodities. We buy and sell them by the pound. They do not have a soul. They're not like us. They're things. It's not a pig. It's ham, right? So this is the underlying, very deep, this goes in at a deep level. This is not taught to us consciously. This is called paradigmatic learning, or learning at the level of a cultural pattern. So to understand this, I think essentially brings us an enormous liberation, because we can realize that all of us have endured a form of desensitization in order to be able to participate in these rituals. Now, I know I'm speaking at the Theosophical Society, where there's this wonderful history and tradition of vegetarianism, and the Theosophical Society was one of the pioneers to bring vegetarianism from Asia to the West. And I love that, because that's a tremendous contribution. I mean, enormous contribution, I think, to our world. And I think the whole idea essentially is to connect with the teaching of ahimsa, which is nonviolence. That's what we're really talking about, essentially, to not harm other living beings. So maybe I'll just tell my own story briefly to kind of lead into the main principles that I want to discuss. The basic idea is, I'll give the principles just briefly, quickly, is that a herding society that's based on eating animal-based foods contributes to harming health in a variety of ways. There's what I refer to as the 5 levels of health. First of all, when we think of health, we think of our physical health, right? How healthy we are physically. Okay, that's one level. There's also environmental health, or ecological health. And we cannot really have very radiant, wonderful physical health if our environment is polluted and the air and water and so forth are polluted. Then that's going to affect us. So this environmental health is very important. A third type of health is cultural health, which is essentially the importance of living in a healthy society. That it's not a good idea to be living in there's this great saying, I love this saying by Krishnamurti. He said, it's not a good idea to be well-adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And I think, we're pointing at the idea that, when we're living in a society, there's very powerful forces that mold us to be like that society, no matter what. And even if we read all the ascended masters, Katumi and Mori and everything else, we still, we're living in a society, and they're very powerful forces that are continually impinging on us. We're bombarded with messages from this society, and they affect us. So having a healthy society is critical. And then those are the 3 outer types of health, but then there's also psychological health and spiritual health, or ethical health. And the basic idea I think we have to understand is that animal agriculture, herding animals, owning them and confining them and eating them and using them for products, is devastating to all 5 levels. It's devastating to all 5 levels. But we're raised in a society where we're taught that this is what made this country great. This is how the West was won. This is the myth, right? Talk about myths. This is the myth. This is why we have a great military and whatever it is. So the whole idea is to basically begin to question the official stories. The Buddhists call that leaving home. Leaving home doesn't necessarily mean you have to leave home and bye everybody, I'm out of here. Leaving home means simply questioning the internalized narratives that we have all been subject to, and try to replace it with our intuition, with our own inner knowing, our own inner wisdom. That's leaving home. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I think if we as a society fail to leave home, if we fail to question the internalized narratives that have been injected into us without our permission, just by being raised in this society and being forced to participate in mealtime rituals of abusing animals, then I don't see how we have a future, quite honestly, because the technology, the population, everything we have is the inertia is so powerful of domination and exploitation and oppression of other living beings. And so but the beautiful thing is I think there is what I refer to as the resurrection of the sacred feminine dimension of consciousness, which is rising in us to question the violence and abuse and exploitation that are in the very fabric of our society, to literally billions of animals every day who experience this directly, and to question that, and then not just question it intellectually, but to actually change the way we're voting, change the way we're living, change the way the choices we're making, so that our lives are in alignment with our values. And that's a critical thing, because I think it's very easy in our society to live our lives not in alignment with our values. And I think that disempowers us. We can have all kinds of wonderful theories about everything, but how are we living our life? How are we living? How does it affect other living beings? The Buddhist tradition talks about the bodhisattva ideal, and this is really the opposite of the herding culture. And the herding culture is based on, I'm going to use and dominate you for my interest. You're an instrument for me to use because I like how you taste, because I want to use you, and your interests don't matter to me. The bodhisattva ideal is the exact opposite of that. It's how can I help you, bless you, help nurture and support you, to live my life in a way, essentially, that the circles of compassion begin to go out of just the narrow few and begin to include all living beings and all forms of life. And I think the Theosophical Society, at its foundation, embraces this idea very explicitly and proclaims it proudly to the world, actually. And so this is, I think, the challenge of our time, not only for the society, but really for humanity. So like in my own life, just very briefly, I was raised in a kind of typical family in Concord, Massachusetts back in the 1950s. And it was kind of a neat place to grow up, because I learned to swim in Walden Pond and went to Thoreau School and was born in Emerson Hospital and went to Alcott School, so the transcendentalists were everywhere, And I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but, later in college I figured out, I was like, well, this is cool, But I realized, Thoreau had the largest library back in the 1840s, I guess it was, of books on Vedanta and Buddhism and the Taoist teachings and in the whole North America. And these were the guys that really were bringing for the very first time these teachings from Asia, right there in Concord. But I was raised in a typical family, eating the usual meals of lots of meat, dairy products, and eggs, and I did not question it. I had no reference point to question it. So I remember eating this, and at one point, I think I was about 7 years old, and I said to my mother, Mom, the kind of food we're eating, is this what everybody eats? And my mother said, yeah, this is human food. This is what people eat everywhere. All over the world, they eat like us, pretty much, yeah. So I said, okay, thanks, I was just wondering. And then she came back a few minutes later, and she said, well, that's not completely true. There are vegetarians. That was a big word I never heard before. And I said, well, what's a vegetarian? She said, don't worry, you'll never meet one. Don't worry about it. She said, I'm a lot older than you are. I never met one. And then she said, I don't know where they get their protein. And I thought, oh, they don't have enough protein. They're probably dragging themselves around, like, help, I need some protein. I'm a vegetarian, help me. So the thing was, my mother was totally right. That was the end of it. I never heard the word again. And I went on my life and eating lots of usual things. And I do remember, I won't go into it in detail, but I do remember when I was about 13, I went away to a summer camp in Vermont. And I went there for several years in the summer when I was in my early teens, 13 years, 14 years old, something like that. And it was affiliated with this wonderful little organic dairy, right? This little organic dairy where nothing bad could ever happen to anyone. But I remember learning at this little dairy, this little farm, it was nestled in the Green Mountains of Vermont and so forth, where to catch a chicken, I remember catching my chicken, I learned how to hold her down, hold her with one hand, have my axe, cut her head off, put her through the scalding tank, and we ate our chickens, right? And so for me as a 13-year-old kid, I didn't enjoy doing it, but it was no problem. Because at that point, one of the things I've realized in my research later was that anthropologists understand that the most powerful ritual in any society are meals. When people get together and eat food together, this is the fundamental, most powerful, important way that any culture transmits its values from generation to generation. The underlying stories about our relationship with animals, with nature, with each other, with God and the cosmos, all that primarily comes through meals. So I was 13 years old. I knew when I killed the chicken that I was doing what God wanted me to do, what Jesus wanted me to do, that they don't have a soul, that we're infinitely superior to them. If you don't eat them, you'll definitely die within 24 hours of a protein deficiency. This is just the way it's set up. It's just, certain animals are here for us to eat. Other animals, we can pet them. Other animals, you stab them. That's just how it is. That's what God wants, right? This is how it is. This is the way of the universe. This is the way everybody wants it. And so I didn't question it. And I remember a little later, there was a dairy cow, right? And they only had a few cows there, but she wasn't giving enough milk anymore. And so on any dairy, I understand it very well now because I've been studying this for years, but even though cows would normally live about 25 years, on any dairy, organic or not, when they reach 5 years old, it's over because their production declines and there's always more calves than they know what to do with. So we put a gun to her head, just right there in the barn, and we just took 3 pulls of the trigger 3 times to kill her. And it was shocking to see her go down and just to see the sheer volume of urine, feces, and blood and everything that just came gushing out of this body of this animal. They're 2,000 pounds. I mean, it's just convulsing on the floor in front of me there. But I never thought for a second we weren't not doing the right thing. It was messy and I didn't like it, but I knew if you couldn't get milk from them, you got to get meat from them. That's their purpose. Their purpose is to serve us. They don't have a purpose. They have no purpose except to give us milk and give us meat and give us something. And I remember actually the following year, we didn't want to do it in the barn, to kill the cow in the barn because it made such a mess on the floor of the barn. So I remember trying to take this cow to this grassy knoll, a little way we're going to do it there. And these animals, she knew she didn't want to go. And so we had like 30 kids on this rope pulling her. Come on, let's go, come on. We couldn't pull her. I mean, cows are strong. So finally, the dairyman said, all right. And he got a chain, put it around her neck, put it on the back of a pickup truck, and just started pulling her. So she's getting pulled along like this. And I was riding in the back of the pickup truck. And I remember we got almost up there, and she broke the chain. And the chain snapped, the pickup truck lurched forward, everybody fell down. I remember I got up and I looked back and I could see this cow looking up at us and this chain hanging from her neck. And she wasn't saying anything, obviously, but I could hear exactly what she was saying. She was saying what I would be saying, which is, please, I don't want to be killed. And I don't remember what happened. I know we did eat that cow and so forth. But I never had anywhere to file that except that this is how it's supposed to be. And I went away to college in Maine, Colby College. And I remember hearing that there were some vegetarians on campus. This was back in the early 70s, but like my mother said, I never actually met one, but I heard there were some around. But then right after that, I left home, and with my brother, we actually left home, and we decided to go on this spiritual pilgrimage. We decided we were going to walk to California. This was in 1975, and I just started reading Thoreau and Emerson, and I remember, you remember the Vietnam War, probably remember all that stuff. So anyway, I was like, we're going to head to California. And I read this one book you probably know, Richard Buck wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness back in the 1890s. And he basically said, most people have what he called self-consciousness, which means I just care basically about myself. But he said certain beings have cosmic consciousness, like the Buddha and Jesus and these great sages and saints, both men and women. And he said it's the destiny and purpose of humanity to attain cosmic consciousness. I remember reading that and going, yes, that's it. I know, I don't want to be just distracted by making money. And I remember telling my parents, Dad, don't you know about cosmic consciousness? And he was like, I'm spending a lot of money on this education for you. What kind of living you got to make studying cosmic consciousness anyway? But anyway, fortunately, he said, well, when I told him we were going to leave and walk off to California, he said, well, every man must march to the beat of the drum that he hears. So we quoted Thoreau, and he was okay with it. But anyway, so we left home. I remember I had some fresh baked cookies from my mother. We had little backpacks, and we headed to California. And we got as far as Buffalo, and it was freezing. It was October, and I thought, oh man, I've got a bachelor's degree from a good school. We better head south. So we headed south. We walked about 20 miles a day, and we were just, we had a book about Ramana Maharshi and Shankaracharya, and we were just meditating on who am I? We were doing this who am I, this deeper and deeper with that question, walking and staying in these little churches in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. We got into the Bible Belt. They tried to save us every night. We kept going, Eastern Kentucky into Tennessee, and we ended up finally, after walking all the way to Tennessee over quite a few months, at a community called The Farm. Now, The Farm at that time was the largest hippie commune in the world. There was about 900 people there, and they were pretty much all from California. So they met us in the middle, because we thought, we could attain cosmic consciousness if we went to California. That was the whole point. So, but we found it, in a sense, in Tennessee, because The Farm we weren't there very long. We were only there for a few weeks, but to me, it was a beautiful example of people living on the land, and they said, we're vegetarians. And so there were 900 vegetarians, and nobody was going, help, I need protein. Oh, they were thriving. They had and the thing is, no one heard of the word vegan in 1975, but they were actually what we would call vegan, because they didn't eat meat or dairy or eggs, and they ate totally plant-based meals. And one guy even kind of blew my mind. He said, I'm wearing vegetarian shoes. Now, that's amazing. But anyway, so I was with these people, and I remember asking this guy, so why are you vegetarians? And they were doing well. I remember that they had about 200 children there, and they were pretty much all vegan from birth, and they were all thriving, doing great. And so I said, why are you guys practicing this and living this way? And he said, well, there's two main reasons. One is, do you know that most of the food we're growing, we're feeding to animals while people are starving? And so we want to eat lower in the food chain so there's enough food for everyone, because food shortages are the driving force behind war and conflict. We want to try to create a world of peace. So we're eating lower in the food chain so that we can have peace. And I said, wow, that's a great thing. And what's the other reason? He said, well, the other reason is, do you know what the animals go through that people are eating? Do you have any idea what they actually go through? I said, oh, don't tell me, I don't want to hear about it. And he didn't say, bless his heart, he said, he just told me a couple little things, but he just mentioned a little, the mutilations, the debeaking, dehorning, the castration without anesthesia, all that stuff, and the hyper-confinement so they can hardly move. And it was like I just got it. I could see. It was almost like somebody mentioned The Wizard of Oz earlier. Remember when Toto pulls the curtain back and you suddenly see what you're not supposed to see, right? That was what it was like. It was like I suddenly saw what I'm not supposed to. We're not supposed to see this. We're supposed to think that we live in this great society. We're good people. We like to have a good steak. We like to have a good cheeseburger. We like to have these things. And we don't like to look behind the curtain of what that costs to the animals who are so abused, horribly abused. But I allowed myself to really look at it, and I saw this vast hell realm that we've forced billions of apparently innocent beings into with no remorse at all. We don't feel any remorse. We just cover it over, look the other way, and go on. It's not that we're bad, evil people. It's just like we're too busy to think about that, right? We're just, this is the way it's always been. But for me, it was a beautiful moment, because I had this living example of 900 people and I was eating with them every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meals of vegetables and grains and beans and so forth. So that was it. From that day in 1975, when I talked to that guy, I have never eaten meat. And that's, I don't know how long that's over 40 years ago. And I continued on with my brother. We ended up eventually at a Zen center in Alabama, if you believe that. and actually through that, I met a Zen teacher and went to study in San Francisco. Eventually went to San Francisco and studied at a Tibetan Buddhist center where I had the opportunity actually to meet the Dalai Lama and translate a book and present it to him from Tibetan into English and get the Bodhisattva vow with him personally, actually. And then study with a Zen teacher who was also a Theosophist, Donald Gilbert, and in Oakland, and so I became a Theosophist way back in 1976, I think it was. So it's been 40 years, and this one teacher told me that I had to read all these books. I had to, to learn how to meditate. I had to read remember the books by A.E. Powell, like the etheric double and the astral body and the mental body and the causal body and this voice. I remember reading The Voice of the Silence many times. And so I was kind of immersed for a while in this theosophical literature, and it all seemed to me to just go right along with the vegetarianism that I was practicing at that time. And the reality of our thoughts and the reality, there's so much more to this world than the physical world. And eventually I decided to shave my head and become a Zen monk. So actually, right before that though, I did more research into the abuse of hens and cows for dairy and egg production. So I became a vegan, actually what they call a vegan, back in 1980. So now it's getting up toward 40 years. And then I shaved my head, became a Zen monk. And I was living in South Korea in a Zen monastery called Sangwon-sa. And we were meditating basically every day from 3 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. It was just sitting, and so I was doing literally thousands of hours of sitting and in silence. And to me, it was two things really stand out about that experience. One was that it was an opportunity to really decolonize myself. I guess the feeling I realized, looking back on it, was like that my mind had been colonized by this toxic program, that I had been born into a society. It wasn't, the thing to remember is that, my parents, everybody, they're all very well-meaning. People are very well-meaning, they're trying to make sure I get healthy food, plenty of calcium, plenty of protein, but that there's this underlying program. And so doing a lot of sitting was an opportunity to just return to this moment and to directly experience or directly get a glimpse that our true nature is vast, like the sky. It's totally free. Our true nature is free and unencumbered and eternal. And that somehow I incarnate through this vehicle, and I'm brought right into a society of competition, of exploitation, of domination of the feminine. And what does that do, actually? I mean, how does that just shut us down? It's a being whose true nature is just shut down that way. And so I began to see also that this community that I was living in, Sangwon-sa, had been practicing what we would call veganism for 800 years. There was no meat, no dairy, no eggs, no wool, no silk, no leather, even mosquitoes. You couldn't just go killing a mosquito. That would be totally verboten. You'd have to kind of put them outside or something. We had these screens, but the whole idea was to live your life as if all living beings mattered, to see all beings as beings, not as things, and to practice ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And I think any wisdom tradition worthy of the name comes to that conclusion, because I think if we quiet our mind enough and look deeply into our true nature, we see that we're not separate from other manifestations of life. It's like these fingers, right? This finger thinks, well, I'm a little taller than you, but I'm stronger than you are. Get out of the way. If I'm playing the piano, that's not going to work very well. My fingers are fighting. They're all of the same hand. It's like us. We're all manifestations of the same life, and the animals also are expressions of life. And when my vision has been hijacked to see beings as instruments, then I can participate in systems of violence and oppression and not really question it because that's what everybody does. So I realized being in this community where they've been practicing this other way of living for hundreds of years, that actually the ancient wisdom traditions on this planet are vibrant and alive. I've been flying the last year or so, 3 times to China, and my flight's been paid for by the Buddhist monasteries in China because they remember this truth. They love it when I come to China and tell people, the Chinese people who are forgotten because of the Western McDonald's and Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken are like taking over China. But the Buddhists and Taoists and the ancient, some of these temples I speak at, we get hundreds, they get sometimes as many as 1,000 people to come and hear me speak about the fact that the ancient wisdom tradition in China and in Asia, this is really the fundamental teaching was of compassion and respect and kindness for other expressions of life. We do not have any spiritual wisdom if we look at other beings as our instruments to use. We don't. If I see a being as something I can use, that's just a program. It's a cultural program. It's not our true nature. And so the thing I realized when I was in Korea is when I came back, it was like I was just like back in the society of everything has a price. Everything is to be used. We even have to sell ourselves on the market. You know, we turn ourselves into an object and write a good resume and sell ourselves. I mean, what I realize is whatever we do to animals, sooner or later we do to each other and to ourselves. We think we're exploiting them, we're getting exploited. And so if we want to liberate ourselves, we have to liberate them. If we don't liberate animals completely, we will never be liberated. Our violence and exploitation of them, however we sugarcoat it or however we pretend or try to rationalize it or say, well, I just love ice cream or whatever it is, we're enslaved because of that cultural program. So I began to see that. So I came back here and ended up writing the World Peace Diet. And since then, the research I've done continues, and I have to say it's so much connects with the teachings of the Theosophical Society because it's the underlying idea is to connect with the truth. What is our true nature, and to connect with our intuition, our inner wisdom, and connect with the ancient teachings and understand them in as illumined a way as we possibly can. And so I want to look at this, since this is an eco-spirituality conference, from the point of view of these levels of health and how they interconnect. And so let's talk about our environmental health, our ecological health for a minute. You know, animal agriculture, has anybody seen the movie Cowspiracy? Oh, great. So some of you have seen it. Yeah, anyway. Yeah. I have a training program called the World Peace Diet Facilitator Training Program, and Kip Anderson, who created that, went through my program, and he made this great movie. If you haven't seen it, you can see it on Netflix, and it's the word conspiracy with a W. But the basic idea is to realize what's something that's been hidden from us, from our understanding, which is that the number one most devastating impact of human activity on this earth is animal agriculture. There's nothing comes close to animal agriculture in terms of destroying our ecosystem. So the greatest gift we can give to the world, and if we just only care about the earth, is to move to a completely plant-based way of living. Organic, I would say, as much as organic, whole foods, plant-based way of living. I mean, don't eat foods that are not organic if possible, because it's pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides are bad for you and bad for birds, fishes, and insects. And again, whole foods is important because these chemical additives and all these things are devastating. They end up in the ecosystems too. But the most important thing is plant-based, because if it's so wasteful. Animal agriculture requires enormous quantities of petroleum and land and water. It takes 1,000 gallons of water in California to make 1 gallon of milk, for example. And this is irrigated water. The aquifers are being sucked dry. My father owned a whole chain of newspapers. And so I understand this very clearly, the problem we're facing, which is that we don't get the news through the mass media. You know, I learned sitting around the table that you do not run news articles that your advertisers don't like. because they will go and advertise with somebody else and you will go out of business. So I see very clearly that when we turn on the TV or read the newspaper, the mass media is basically the voice of corporations and financial institutions that do not have our interests at heart. They have their corporate interests at heart. And so we are not told the truth of animal agriculture, because the biggest advertisers are the fast food industries, pharmaceutical industries, these industries that make billions of dollars off sick people and off of destroyed ecosystems. Animal agriculture, like right now, we're cutting down, by conservative estimate, about an acre per second of rainforest. This is crazy. These are the lungs of the earth. We are, right this minute, we're cutting down about an acre per second of rainforest. And the driving force, one reason for that is to cut down rainforest, to grow soybeans, to feed to imprisoned cows, pigs, and chickens. And factory farmed fishes eat huge amounts of soy also. And so we're also overfishing the oceans. And these two things together are driving what's called the Sixth Extinction. We're in the middle of the largest mass extinction of species in 65 million years. We're losing genetic diversity because of human activity. That human activity is animal agriculture, because not only are we destroying the rainforests, which are very rich in genetic diversity, but also the oceans by overfishing them and by polluting them, and global climate destabilization, which is also driven a lot by animal agriculture, the loss of water resources, and the loss of soil erosion, pollution of air and water. Animal agriculture is so wasteful, and the beautiful thing to understand behind that, though, the good news is that according to the United Nations and virtually all the studies on this, when we move to a plant-based way of eating, we shrink our environmental footprint, not just like by 1 or 2, which would be great, but by like 10 or 15 times, So we're talking about like a person eating a standard American or Western diet using 15 times as much water and land and creating pollution as someone eating a plant-based diet. So as we move that way, we can enormously reduce our impact, and we can allow our ecosystems to heal. So that's the beautiful vision, is to realize that we can feed everyone on this earth. That this earth is enormously abundant and can feed everyone. The population we have now, we're growing enough food every year to feed roughly 10 billion people. I mean, nobody argues this. Some people say 9 billion, some people say 11 billion, but way more than 7.5 billion. And yet we have roughly 1 billion people starving, right now, going hungry. Our brothers and sisters are starving when we're growing enough food to feed plenty, all of us, more than enough. The problem, again, is animal agriculture. And again, if you look at it in depth, you'll see that where this is happening, the land is being used to grow corn and soy for dairy and meat production, while people go hungry and go starving. And so this is the interconnectedness of ecosystems and environmental health. If we want to really make a healthier environment for ourselves and stop the exploitation of ecosystems, the greatest thing we can do is to move to a plant-based diet, and also for other human beings, hungry people, if we care about other hungry people, to move to a plant-based way of living. Because if I'm eating animal foods, I'm using my vote, my dollars, to basically take grain that could feed hungry people and feed it to animals. And the system is set up that way. And it's easy for us to do that in industrialized nations with high-powered economies, but people in less industrialized nations with less high-powered economies, they are vulnerable in our hands. And so the big financial institutions and corporations are using us to dominate and exploit. And those food shortages create conflict and war, and that's a big business. War is a huge business. And so if we want to help peace in this world, again, it comes back to allowing animals to live their lives, allowing ecosystems to be healthy, and allowing the rivers to come back, the oceans to heal, and allowing people who are hungry to be fed. And then the other thing to remember, I'm talking now about environmental health and cultural health, having a healthy society where the people are fed, is to remember that there are workers who have to do the work. And I know it's painful to hear about it, but on animal agriculture operations, dairies, and all animal agriculture operate, all of them, people have to do hideous work. And they have to impregnate animals against their will on rape racks all day. They have to extract semen from bulls and other animals all day. They have to beat and electroshock and kick animals who do not want to do what we want them to do. That's what, if we're eating dairy or meat or eggs, we're paying people to do work, and these workers have the highest rates of drug addiction, alcoholism, suicide, spousal abuse, and they have what's referred to as perpetrator-induced traumatic stress disorder. They're traumatized by having to brutalize animals all day. And that's what I'm eating. If I'm eating meat, dairy products, and eggs, I'm eating trauma. I'm causing trauma. I'm directly voting for and causing trauma in workers, in animals, in ecosystems, in hungry people, in slaughterhouse workers. And then what am I eating? I'm eating trauma. These animals are traumatized. They are. I mean, I've heard myself. We lived in an RV for 18 years, and I've been to slaughterhouses. I've seen the cows being electroshocked and pushed off, and how they don't want to go. And I've seen all this stuff, and I've seen the workers and how dead they are inside. It's tragic to see that. And I've heard the dairy cows, when I've been camped near a dairy, all night long the mothers bellowing because their babies are stolen. Because that's not your baby, that's my baby, and that's not your milk, that's my milk. And I'm going to kill your baby, and I'm going to steal your milk, and I'm going to kill you. That's what it is. That's what dairy operations are. They kill. It's a rape and kill operation. And so these animals are terribly abused and traumatized, and then we feed that to our children. Like, as little kids, we had to eat it ourselves. We don't know what we're doing. We're asleep as a society. We're completely asleep. We're being exploited by industries that make money on sickness and war and environmental devastation. That's what's happening, actually. We're being exploited. As we exploit, we're exploited. So the whole idea is to realize that the beauty of the earth is available to us. The beauty of animals is available to us. The beauty of nature is available to us when we are worthy. When we live our lives in a way that shows that we're worthy of this beautiful planet. If we're not worthy of being here, we'll get kicked off. And as we kick everybody else off, we'll get kicked off with them because we're causing the mass extinction. There's this U.S. governmental agency called the Department of Wildlife Services. It sounds like they're here to serve wildlife. They're actually paid by our taxpayer money to kill animals for ranchers and farmers. And they kill millions of coyotes and bobcats and wild horses and otters and skunks and opossums and geese and cormorants. Every animal you can ever think of is being targeted and killed with our taxpayer money on behalf of ranchers and farmers because they don't want any other animals alive except their cows and pigs and goats and sheep. So it's a war. It's a war against nature, unfortunately, is a real reality that we're engaged in. And it's supported by our paying for meat, dairy products, and eggs with our dollars. And if we can pretend that it's not existing, but the beauty is, what I've discovered is once I just realize it and bring my life into alignment with my values, it's just so great. It's like everything lines up and our health gets better, our psychological health gets better, our spiritual health. We begin to see in a new way. And I think this is the future that's beckoning to us. And so I mentioned earlier the physical health aspect, right? And I won't talk too much. I have a whole chapter in the World Peace Diet called The Intelligence of Human Physiology, which basically discusses what kind of foods are we designed to eat. And if we just look at our physiology, right, our physical bodies, it's very clear that we are not designed to eat animal foods. I mean, meat, for example, we can eat it. We can eat it if we have to, for sure. I mean, we can eat it. But cows can eat meat, right? I mean, most people don't realize, for example, that cows are fed huge amounts of meat in our society. Like for example, if I'm eating dairy products, I'm eating a lot of meat because cows are fed fish meal. I mean, that's standard procedure. The cows would normally eat grass, right? But dairy operators and beef operators, they don't want to feed grass because grass, you don't give a lot of milk and you don't get very fat. So they enrich the feed with grain, corn and soy, wheat and oats, alfalfa. This is very hard on the digestive system of cows, but it makes them very sick, but they give a lot more milk and they get fatter. They make more money. So they eat, but they don't stop there with grain. They enrich it with meat. So cows on dairy operations and on beef operations are eating fish meal. They're eating the rendered offal and flesh from cows, other cows actually, until mad cow disease, not supposed to do that anymore. But pigs, chickens, turkeys, dogs and cats that are euthanized, cows are eating all that. Cows are eating all that and making their milk from all that. And making their, and so, and you gotta remember, this all concentrates toxins. I mean, all the toxins that we create, all the heavy metals, PCBs, dioxins, pesticide, herbicide, fungicide runoff, all that ends up in the water, it ends up in the oceans, it ends up concentrating in fish, especially. Fish are then fed to cows. Cows eat all that fish. Cows eat more fish than people do in the United States, according to some research. They eat a lot of fish. So these toxins are concentrated, PCBs and also nuclear radiation, for example, all that stuff is concentrating in the flesh and secretions, mammary secretions of these animals, and then we're eating that. And we have a cancer industry that's making hundreds of billions of dollars. It's getting so wealthy on cancer, right? I mean, millions and billions of profits are being made by this cancer epidemic. And people just eat all this dairy, they eat all this meat. They think, they don't make the connection, but that's the thing to understand. So to realize that we have a physiology that's designed for plant-based foods. We have, and I go into it, our dentition, our saliva, our whole jaw structure, our digestive system, the length of our tract, our circulatory system, our everything. So we can be like cows, we can eat meat, even though we're not supposed to, and it does make us sick. And we do get exploited like the cows do. We spend a lot of money with cancer and heart disease and strokes and osteoporosis and diabetes and dementia. All these are linked to animal-based diets. We're at much higher risk if we're eating animal-based foods. And we're definitely not designed for dairy products. I mean, no one can begin to make that argument. We're not little cows. We don't have renin, which is the main enzyme that calves have to digest casein. We can't digest casein, the main protein in cow's milk, which it's well understood to be the driving force behind breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, type 1 diabetes. It's casein. And so I remember as a little kid growing up, I had, the usual problems. I had sore throats, runny noses, earaches, appendicitis, tonsillitis. It's all dairy, right? It makes a lot of money. It's very, very profitable for these industries, but we're not designed for that. And so the basic teaching, I guess in one sentence, simply is this, that all of us have been given this wonderful gift, I feel, of a physical body that does not require any animal to suffer to get all the nutrients that we need to be healthy. And yet all of us have been born into a society where we've been basically required from the time we were little infants to participate in these mealtime rituals where we basically learn to take that gift we've received and refuse it. And say, well, we're going to stab and imprison and exploit animals anyway and eat them and their products. And we cause enormous suffering to them and to ourselves. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's the great good news. I remember, how many of you, for example, have heard of the Grand Canyon, have been to the Grand Canyon? Yes, good. So we were there. I mean, I'm in my mid-60s, so I was there a few years ago. And I remember we were in our RV and we were camped on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and it's so beautiful to look out over these vistas and see this vast canyon. And I noticed that everywhere I went, there are these signs that say, danger, warning, never attempt to hike all the way down to the Colorado River and back up in one day. That's not a day trip. People die trying to do that. Don't do it. And so I said to Madeline, I'm going to try that. And so I took off the next morning and went down. It's called the Bright Angel Trail, down. And I finally got to the Colorado River at the bottom, and there was a sign saying, no swimming. So I took a quick swim, and it's hot down there, turned around, went back up, and I was back up on the rim again just before noon for lunch. And Madeline said, whoa, how'd you do that so fast? I said, well, I'm in pretty good shape, but, those signs aren't made for vegans. Those signs are made for typical people who probably would die if they tried to do that. But if we're eating the diet we're designed for, we have a lot of energy. And that's been for me, one of the great joys of my life in the last 40 years is that I don't get sick and I have a lot of energy. I mean, it's a side benefit, I never moved to a vegan way of living because I cared about my health, really. I mean, I did it because I couldn't countenance paying people to stab and rape animals and eat their products. That was like not going to happen. But I found that as a side benefit, I get great health, And this is generally, I'm not the only one. Generally, people who eat a healthy plant-based diet have far lower rates of all the diseases that are filling up the hospitals and giving so much money to this. I call it the military, industrial, meat, medical, pharmaceutical, media complex, this vast complex. And, we don't have to feed that thing. We can be healthy without that. So that's the sort of the outer level, our physical health, our environmental health, and our cultural health. But I think I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the inner side of this, how it affects us psychologically, how it affects us spiritually. And basically, the basic thing is this. When I'm sitting at the table and I'm eating these foods that are actually not very healthy for me physically as a little kid, I'm also eating attitudes, right? I'm eating a whole way of seeing the world. And there's many aspects to these attitudes. I can talk a long time about that. I'll just pick three of the big ones. One of them, very obvious one, is an attitude of disconnectedness. And the fundamental teaching I'm getting as I'm eating animal foods is don't make the connection. Don't think about what it took to get it on your plate. Don't go there. If someone were to say, Sunday morning or whatever, and people are eating their oatmeal and coffee and orange juice and bacon, and someone says, this bacon's pretty good. I wonder what she was like. What? She was like, that's not a she, that's an it. You can't do that. Don't go there. Don't think of it. That's the dreaded thing that no one can ever do. So we're taught with every meal to stay shallow, to not listen deeply, to not look deeply, to not feel deeply, to just follow orders, to just do what we're told, just eat it. Just stay on the shallow level. Veganism, essentially, or any spiritual practice, ahimsa, is about looking deeply. Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, what does that mean? Avalokiteshvara means he or one who hears the cries of the world, right? Listens deeply and hears and feels and has a heart of compassion. And being raised in a herding society where we're eating animal foods, that is stomped on. You do not do that. You do not make connections. You learn to, and really, in systems theory, the ability to make connections is intelligence. That is the definition of intelligence. As soon as you break the ability to make connections and to respond to feedback, you've just basically dumbed down the system, right? So we are all raised in a society where we are extremely, unfortunately, our intellectual and affective or emotional capacities are just shut down by being raised in society where we're forced to eat animal-based foods, which works great, right? If you want to have people who are basically easily controllable, who will buy what you want them to buy, you just feed them these foods, and that's what happens. So that's one. Another one is commodification. Every meal is basically teaching us, again, at a deep level, we never talk about this explicitly, but the basic teaching that goes in, we eat it goes into our cells, is not only disconnectedness, but also beings are not beings. Certain beings are things. It's learning to look with an eye where we, instead of seeing a being, we just see an object, an instrument to be used. And again, this not only causes us to be capable of enormous violence and abuse of other beings, but we do the same thing to ourselves as a society. We disconnect from nature and we disconnect from ourselves. Animal agriculture forces us to disconnect from nature and disconnect from other expressions of nature and just eat them, see them as objects to be used. And so we create a whole economic system based on commodification of life where we turn ourselves and each other into objects in a heartless economic system. And we see the consequences of that. But if you're going to eat meat and dairy products, that's what you're going to have. It's not going to be any other way. We have to understand that. If we want to eat meat and dairy products, we will live in that kind of a world because it creates not only the outer reality of devastation of nature and our society and our health, but an inner world that's incapable of actually making connections and seeing beings as beings and having a sense of respect and kindness for them because every meal is teaching us from infancy not to do that. So we have to take the initiative to question this and resurrect our own intelligence and resurrect our own sensitivity and resurrect our behavior so that we're not living in this way and encouraging and empowering and fueling a system of exploitation and violence, which is destroying the possibility of our children having a world. Eco-psychology and spirituality is about this connection. And then the third one is what I refer to in the World Peace Diet as the domination of Sophia. Sophia, as you all know, was the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom. We get Theosophy, right? Sophia is wisdom, and so this Sophia to me is the feminine wisdom that is within all of us. All of us, whether we're men or women, we have this basic wisdom that yearns to nurture and protect life. And again, what is being raised in a society of animal agriculture? It's based on the core thing, the core action of animal agriculture is breaking the mother-child bond. That's the core thing. There's two things that happen in animal agriculture. One is you kill them. The other is you artificially inseminate them, which is a nice way of saying raping. You rape them and then you kill them. And so we have to understand this is happening on a scale, on an industrial scale. Millions every day of cows and other animals are being impregnated on rape racks. Their babies are being stolen. The mother-child bond is being broken. And we're feeding, and we're not only causing this kind of anguish to these mothers and babies, but we're feeding it to our children and we're eating it. We're causing it and we're eating it. We're eating this whole thing. And so this not only causes enormous suffering for these animals who are powerless in our hands, whose purposes we steal, who we reduce to mere machines, but it rebounds to us, and we find that we have conflict. We have, it's ironic. For example, the pharmaceutical industry, they make profits from three areas. I don't know if you know the three main areas of the pharmaceutical industry makes all its money. I'll just tell you, because one is huge profits are made from selling pharmaceutical products to animal agriculture, right? There's over 10,000 different drugs and hormones and antibiotics, chemicals that are administered to the animals that we eat and whose dairy products and eggs we eat. Okay, that's one huge profit center for pharmaceutical. That's why it's actually the pharmaceutical industry that's most against my message, even more than the animal agriculture industry. Secondly, their big profits come, of course, then people eat this stuff, right, and then they get sick, right? So the pharmaceutical industry makes huge profits for people who have diabetes and liver disease and kidney disease and heart disease, all this from eating animal foods. Okay, that's their second profits. But then the third one, the biggest of all, actually, does anyone know what it is? The biggest profits of the big three? Anyone know? The pharmaceutical industry, its profits from psychological illness. Right? There's physical illness, there's animals, and there's psychological. So the biggest profits, actually, for the pharmaceutical industry is medications for depression, insomnia, anxiety, panic attacks, chronic pain, And of course, and the animals we're eating, what are they suffering from? Depression, insomnia, anxiety, chronic pain, despair. I mean, they're driven into insanity. These animals are driven insane. They're literally banging their heads against the bars, driven totally. Can you imagine if you can't move for years, or months? They're driven, pigs are just banging their heads. So we cause insanity onto these animals. We break their sacred bonds of the mother and child, and we not only cause them to go crazy and have no culture, no family is allowed. What does that do to our families? How can we have healthy families when we break their families? How can we have healthy bodies when we break their bodies? How can we have healthy minds when we break their minds? I mean, how can we do this? How can we live in a society where we continue to do this and pretend that everything's okay, actually, that we're spiritual, whatever that means? What does it mean to be spiritual in a society like this? What does it mean to be at a conference on eco-spirituality when this is the reality? You leave here and go out into the world, this is it. And the thing, I guess, to remember is that the only reason anyone eats animal foods, there's only one reason anybody does it, and it's all the same. It's the same for me. It's because we're following orders. It's the only reason. We're just following orders. We're doing what we've been told to do. That's the only reason. These orders were injected into us so early. We're just infants. We're part of our tribal, right? This is what our tribe eats. You don't question that. So it's hard to question it. I understand. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying we've inherited this. In the World Peace Diet, I'm running out of time here. The World Peace Diet talks a little bit, I just want to mention just briefly the history of the takes a couple of minutes, but just to understand this, because we talked in some of the other earlier talks about the past. I just want to say, the chapter in the World Peace Diet called about our culture's roots. And the thing to realize is when we go back 10,000 years to the time in the Levant, or the Eastern Mediterranean, when our culture formed basically in the early days, in what is today Iraq, we see that there was a revolution. And I refer to it as the herding revolution. And for the very first time on planet Earth, people started to own animals as property for food. It's called herding them. It was wild sheep, and then wild goats, and then 2,000 years later, wild cows. And it changed our entire society in profound ways. Number one, people started to see animals as just objects to be used, so they were reduced. There was a rising for the very first time on planet Earth of a wealthy elite class. Does that sound familiar? A wealthy elite. And why was this wealthy class so powerful and wealthy? Only one reason: they owned livestock. Whoever owned the most livestock was the most wealthy and the most powerful. So I used to teach college courses on the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey and the ancient Old Testament writings. So those were about 3,000 years ago. So 3,000 years ago, we can read the writings, we can see by that time, the society's in place. There's a wealthy elite, the kings, right? They're wealthy because they own the most livestock. And then what did they do? They invented two institutions. One is war. There had never been war on this earth until animal agriculture. The very first word for war is the ancient Sanskrit word gavya. It literally means the desire for more cows. Because one of these wealthy guys would see somebody else with a lot of cows, and he'd say, I want to take those and double my wealth, right? But they wouldn't give up without a fight. So for the first time, we had these large-scale wars, and war is a terrible thing. But anyway, that was the beginning of war because of animal agriculture and the rise of a wealthy elite. And then not only did they invent war, which we still have with us today, which is devastating our society, like animal agriculture, is they go together. You can't have one without the other. The other is slavery. There had never been slavery before. But as soon as you had animal agriculture and you're owning other beings, and you have war, whoever lost the war, what happened? The war, the livestock became the property of the victors, and then the people who lost, they also became the property of the victors. And we had now slavery, where people are bought and sold, and they became wealth as well. And we also had the domination of women, because basically what animal agriculture is learning to look at females not as beings, but as breeders. They're just here for my use. They're here for my pleasure. They're here to give me sons. That's what they're here to be. And so by that time, you can read it, all about it. Women are bought and sold like chattel property. And so we had the arising also of the role model for young boys to emulate was the model of the hard, tough, disconnected male, the John Wayne herder, the macho male, because you needed men whose natural sense of tenderness and mercy and gentleness had been suppressed, so they could dominate animals and dominate women and dominate other herders. And so we had the arising of this type of patriarchal, warlike society, and they began taking over and dominating others and destroying others and spreading throughout the Eastern Mediterranean to the Northern Mediterranean to Europe, Central Asia. They came over to North and South America, as you know. The Indians talked about these people coming over with their slave animals, and basically it's still spreading today. I mean, it's still spreading through ConAgra, Cargill, Monsanto, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, the IMF, the World Bank, the U.S. foreign policy, everything. It's the same system, and we're born into it, and that's what it is. And if we keep eating animal foods, it'll keep going, and there won't be nothing will be left here. So I think the good news is, and I can feel it as I travel and just see it happening, is that there is this resurrection of Sophia, of the sacred feminine. And I think Theosophy has an important part to play. I mean, Theosophy is really based on the ancient wisdom teachings. And I think it's very important that we spread ahimsa to include all living beings, that we include all animals, that we encourage each other to question the traditions that allow us to dominate and exploit other animals for meat, for dairy products, for eggs, or for any use. And to realize that we don't need to, right? I mean, here I am. I'm, 37 years I'm a vegan, I'm still standing, right? And there's millions more like me, right? So it's doable. And I think as we do that, and take time to meditate, to read and study, to contemplate, the ancient wisdom, to bring the wisdom alive, because if we don't bring this ancient wisdom alive in our generation and pass it on to our children, what good is it? It's not about just learning it, it's about living it. We have to live this. If we're not living it, it's just a bunch of words. So to live this and how we live it, how is our life from the point of view of cows, pigs, chickens, and foxes and turkeys and ducks and hungry people and slaughterhouse workers and future generations and ecosystems, this whole interconnected mandala of life. And I think when we look from a deep perspective, we can see that we have the opportunity today, all of us, to do what we can to make an effort to understand the consequences of animal agriculture and herding of animals, and then to bring our lives into alignment with that, and then to somehow be a voice for a world, like Gandhi said, to be the change we'd like to see in the world, and to be a voice for those who don't have a voice.
I was thinking about grains and how grains are kind of getting a bad rap these days.
Yes.
And I also think about the fact that agriculture has really made civilization possible. And I really like civilization. And I'm really conflicted about that because of the ecological damage that civilization does. But what you said made me realize that grain agriculture and animal agriculture really arose together. So I guess there's kind of two questions there. The question my original intention was, what about grains? Why are they getting such a bad rap, and is that valid or what? And what is the relationship with animal agriculture?
Great, yeah. Just very briefly, so we don't have a lot of time. There's two kinds of agriculture, plant and animal. And plant agriculture, grain agriculture, I think essentially could be done in a very harmonious, healing way. Growing grain, growing fruits, growing vegetables. We can do this in a loving, nurturing, organic way and feed everyone. And a small scale, I think this is the way of the future. People feeding each other with plant-based agriculture. But we live in a society that's basically organized around animal agriculture, so we do plant agriculture very often the way we do animal agriculture, which is domination. So we use pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, GMOs, and this kind of monocropping, which is very violent. But grains themselves give us complex carbs that they're healthy, and complex grains like corn and oats and wheat and so forth, soy and alfalfa and all those things. These are very healthy for us. But I think they're given a bad name mainly because of the meat dairy industries, primarily. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I guess. Oh, okay.
What did your mom say when you became vegetarian?
What did my mother say when I became vegetarian? Actually, my mother, bless her heart, she had me feed my little sister when I was a kid, and I made my mother said, you better make sure your sister gets enough protein, and I would make my little sister eat the meat, and I feel so bad about it now. I'd say, because she kept spitting it out. She was in her high chair, and I kept giving her the meet. I'd say, you've got to get your protein, and I'd make it like an airplane. Here comes the protein, and she kept spitting it out, so I was forcing it down her throat, And and then when I went vegan, I tried to convert my sister and my mother, I said, come on. And they're both very beautiful. They're great people. They're both, Christians, fundamentalist Christians, and I showed them videos and talked. But eventually, at one point, my sister called and said, the Lord came to me and told me to go vegan. I'm so glad. And she's been a vegan now for 15 or 20 years, a long time. And her daughter is vegan, and her daughter now has two little babies, and they're three boys, and they're all vegan from birth. And my mother went vegan too, and she's in her late 80s now, but she's the only one in her retirement community in Florida who's not on any meds. She's on no meds, she's still getting around, so she's doing great, yeah.
I'd like to point out that essentially all of your lecture we have documented and a flyer down here on the second floor, and I've been involved with this for several years, but from the aspect of your health and for the sustainability and for compassion, they're all documented. A China study book, a Cowspiracy documentary, What the Health, another one on health. And so if anybody has any doubt about it, we've got the documentation for it.
Great.
Thank you.
That's good. Good to hear. Thank you. Thank you.
Your message about the rape and murder culture is very powerful. And then you also made a statement about how spiritual we are if we participate in that by eating animal products. I was wondering, so if you decide that you're going to start to extract yourself from that culture by going vegan, however, maybe you work in a global corporation that supports various trucking industries, animal agricultural, and you're enabling that. Does your spirituality grow because you've personally made that decision, but haven't been able to extract yourself from how you earn a living, or what you've been trained to do to earn your living?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, because our life is a whole system. I think, quite honestly, what I'm talking about with this talk for me is a journey. And it's not about somebody being right and somebody being wrong. It's like we're all wounded. We're all in the process of healing. We're all living in a society that gives us a lot of difficult situations to deal with. We have to make money. We have to deal with social situations. It's not about judging, blaming, shaming anyone. It's just understanding our society, and then each of us accepting where we are in our journey, and then making our steps as best we can. So in your case, I would just say, whatever you can change that you feel would help bring more healing to the world and to yourself. Like you have control over your meals, right? What you're paying for, and so you move to a more plant-based way of buying and eating, and then you can look at your job, and if I'm working in an industry that I feel is not in alignment with my values, okay, then work with that. I think. It's important to do all these things, because I think if I'm working in a job where I feel that I'm contributing to the problem, it's not as great of a feeling as if I'm working a job where I'm just doing something I love and I feel like I'm contributing, I'm living my purpose, my passion. It's all lined up, So it's a challenge, but each one of us has the opportunity, and we can support each other in doing that. I think, that's why I have this training, the World Peace Diet training. It's two things. One is how we can thrive as vegans in a not yet vegan world, which is not easy to do because of social pressures and nutritional confusion and all these things. But then the other part is how we can be effective as advocates, how we can bring this message. Because from my point of view, the best way to bring this message to the world is by our own example. To be loving and kind and caring and respectful of others. If we're living that way, then our message will be spread that way. It's not about changing other people. I can't change anybody. How many people can I change? One. I change myself. So if I can make myself more of an expression of love and respect, that's the key. So as you do that, and then as you see how that can play out in your life as an ongoing journey, then your life will be, I think, well lived. And to remember that this life is short. We only have a few years here. Maybe we get 10 decades if we're lucky, 11. If you eat a lot of sprouts, maybe you get 11 decades, But, we only get a few decades. It goes by very quickly. So to use each day, to be grateful for every day is another opportunity to make another step in my journey, to move more to the reality of the truth that I am, and to allow that to radiate into the world and to discover that. That's it. Each one of us can do that the best we can, and as we do that, we encourage others to do the best they can. Yeah.